Hi everybody, welcome to the webinar. It is Wednesday, May 23rd, 2016. As I said on Monday night, this is one of my favorite and oldest webinars. Some of you have heard me talk about The Drama of the Gifted Child by Alice Miller as being one of the most impactful and influential books in my life as a therapist as it relates to child development and parenting. I would say that this book is the second most important and influential book in my life that I read early on in my career. I think what makes it so exciting for me, and also the parallel that this book has with The Drama of the Gifted Child, is it made me aware of the breadth and the depth of my unconscious. It was an exciting realization to realize how much was inside of me that I couldn't see, that I wasn't aware of, that was having an impact, that was essentially running my life, and still to this day continues to impact and run my life at times. And so it became an exciting realization for me to discover it, to see this, what I like to call an underground river that existed inside of me. And so Carl Jung's idea of the shadow, which is, we're going to talk about that tonight, we're going to talk about the book Meeting the Shadow, is our very, very generally our unconscious or our unknown or our split off parts. And the most important thing that I can say about this is that when we see those things in our child, those things that frighten us, those things that scare us, those things that repulse us, our children are apt or likely to develop the same kinds of reactions to those things. The problem with that is, while some of those things can be frightening and destructive, is that they take with them some very important and creative parts of ourselves. It's like that idea that in childhood, our make-believe friends and characters, when stuffed under the bed or in the closet, become monsters. They mutate. And they become a distortion of what they started out to be. So we'll talk about that tonight. I'll introduce the concepts, and hopefully it will be as exciting for you. And if nothing else, it can be an invitation to explore this concept in this specific book. The quotes in this tonight are going to be from Carl Jung, of course. One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. The latter procedure, however, is disagreeable and therefore not popular. When I talk about some of the aspects of the shadow, I get sometimes a reaction from parents that it's uncomfortable for them. Sometimes I actually get a response from my clients and their parents, a religious response, that there's such an association in many religious perspective that to look into those dark parts of ourselves, that we're looking into the evil. That's not the way that Carl Jung thinks about it. That's not the way that therapists think of it. And so as somebody asked me years ago, walked up to me after a meeting and was discussing with me the idea and said, you know, some of the things that you're teaching don't line up with what my pastor, my reverend, is teaching me at church. And what I learned to say over time is, you can go to your reverend and to your pastor to learn about religion, but I'm here to talk about psychology. I don't know about religion. I can't teach you about your religion, but what I can teach you about is the psychology of human beings. So let's talk about the shadow and talk about what it is. It comes from an idea in Jungian psychology, and Carl Jung was a pupil of Sigmund Freud, and they eventually had a departure in philosophy and in their friendship, and I'll talk a little bit about that. The idea mostly for Jung was that there was both a personal and a collective unconscious. That in the world, there are archetypes, there are themes, there are symbols, there are stories that resonate with all of us. The one story that I'm going to talk about tonight is, for example, the story of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. We can see that theme of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde in many of our stories, many of our popular stories and many of our myths. And so when we see something like that in that story that resonates with so many people, Jung considered that an archetype. And cultures share archetypes. And in some ways, the whole human race shares archetypes. That's why we can look into our dreams and we can see themes. And we can do interpretation of our dreams to say there are certain aspects of our dreams that resonate with us. That's why we can see things in art that resonate with many of us, that evoke very similar types of reactions and responses. So Jungian psychology had this idea. It was a very mythical psychology, and it lent itself well to people that were religiously or spiritually inclined, and then had this piece of the collective unconscious. Carl Jung talked about art therapy, and he talked about art in general, and he proposed that art can be used to alleviate or contain feelings of trauma, fear, or anxiety, and also to repair, restore, and heal. See, the thing about Jungian psychology, the thing about this type of psychology, where there are archetypes and collective unconscious, is that the more abstract the medium of expression, the more pure and honest it is, right? Sigmund Freud said that dream interpretation is the royal road to the unconscious, because it comes to us in this kind of coded, symbolic language. It is much more honest. And if we don't take things literally, we can begin to see the meaning of them behind the symbols. Many of us have shadow dreams, and they talk about shadow dreams throughout this book, of that thing that is intensely frightening, right? Could be a bear, could be a shark, could be something very mysterious and gloomy, could be a ghost, could be something evil that we identify with. And our fear of that thing is that we will become absolutely annihilated by it. And that's a constant theme. A lot of children in our program begin to have shadow dreams, begin to understand that there's parts of themselves that are bubbling up, that are manifesting themselves in their symptoms that get them sent to a vote, and that they need to confront and deal with. Many people, as they go through a midlife crisis, are confronted with the shadow aspects of themselves, where they begin to question those things that they have come to believe on a conscious level are the things that can destroy them. Depression can be evidence of your shadow emerging, right? That part of you needs to be put away. Part of you needs to die in order for a new part of you to be born. So the shadow is that energy. It is that part of us that we fear, that we don't want to deal with. And I'll give you specific concrete examples later. But that can also, like I said, hold with it a great source of energy and creativity. And in many ways, a lot of the solutions that we're seeking in life. Brene Brown talks about this in her talk. I'm sure many of you have looked at the TED Talk videos by Brene Brown. And she talks about going through, in her first, most famous one, where she talks about shame. She talks about this idea when she talked about going through a midlife crisis, right? Having a breakdown. And her therapist, in true Jungian fashion, said, I'm considering what you're going through a spiritual awakening. And then she laughs and the audience laughs. But that's the way that Carl Jung would think about it. He would say, that is your unconscious coming to the surface. And at first it's chaotic and terrifying and confused. But it's trying to talk to you. It's trying to teach you something. I think in many ways, our children, our children that are in this program are creating that same kind of invitation for us to look at life differently, to consider, to let go of old constructs, old ideas. Most of you, when sharing with me about the impact that the program has on you, we'll talk about it in those words. It has changed me. I had a parent recently say at an intensive that she had the most frightening experience when she considered the fact that one of her long-held beliefs wasn't true. And then she followed it with, because I began to realize that everything I believed was up for grabs. That's a terrifying idea, right? When white becomes black and black becomes white, and we have to reinvent our sense of self and our sense of what it means to be in the world, that can be an overwhelming process, and it can lead to all the kind of symptoms that both our children are demonstrating, but also that we experience in our midlife crises. The creation of the shadow is through repression. We get the message about what's unacceptable. And it's different in different families. Anger is unacceptable. Sensuality is unacceptable in some families. Sadness is unacceptable, right? Being loud or getting a lot of attention is unacceptable. Different cultures have different ideas about what's unacceptable, right? And we tend to romanticize and glorify other cultures, right? We can look back on Native Americans and say, well, look at their sense of community. Look at their sense of village. But what they missed sometimes was the sense of individuality, whereas we can look at in our society and say there's an overemphasis on individuality. And in other cultures, we value the sense of camaraderie, of kinship, of allness that they have. So cultures, families, communities, religious groups all have a different definition of what is acceptable, what is to be honored, and something that we're supposed to celebrate, and those things that we are supposed to put away and put in the closet and get rid of and split off, right? Like it says here, that can come from parents, peers, society, siblings, right? This is what black people do. This is what white people do. This is what boys do. This is what girls do, right? This is what smart people do. This is what athletic people do. We learn the rules about what should and shouldn't be. And we take those other parts of ourselves from all of these messages and we stuff them down. And that stuffing down creates the shadow self, the part of ourself that is unexpressed, unwanted. So we create these split off selves. And the idea in Jungian psychology is to recognize and to learn to own and to integrate. It is the idea that when we can make the unconscious conscious, when we can embrace the shadow, when we can face our inner demons and make peace with them, we begin to have access to the light, to the wisdom, to the honesty, to the truth, to the creativity that they have to offer us. That's why so many artists can be frightening for mainstream culture, or could be confusing, or even judged by mainstream culture, because they're more willing to explore that part of themselves. In Jungian psychology, they would talk about balance and harmony with oneself. They would de-emphasize the idea of being good or getting it right or cooperating or behaving themselves. Those would be de-emphasized, not as celebrated as developing a whole, more honest, more authentic sense of self. In contrast to Freud, who talked about these specific visceral sexual drives, Jung had the idea that we have many drives. We have a spiritual drive also, a drive to be connected to something more divine than ourselves. So that was something different. And again, like I said, the collective unconscious and the shared consciousness that we have with others in our community, others in our society, others in our time, others in the world, was something that Freud would talk about, where Jung would talk about, whereas Freud would talk about the individual unconscious, didn't talk about the shared. Jung talks about it this way, that the ego is like the light and the shadow is the shade, right? The ego is the thing that we can see, the thing that we're conscious of. And the shadow is the thing that is behind that is obscured by us because of that repression. It's more than just lust, greed, and suicidal murder tendencies, but those exist down there also, right? Those passions exist in there, in our personal shadow. So how can we come to understand, recognize the shadow, to meet the shadow as they talk about in this book? We can see it in our humor, right? The things that we laugh at in our jokes. A sexual part mentioned, or something unexpected, or somebody slipping on a banana. Those are our shadow selves. In fact, the more developed our sense of humor is, Jung would suggest, the less repressed our shadow self is. The less of a sense of humor we have, the more repressed we are. So they come to us in our humor, in our stories, in our dreams, in our fantasies, in our myths. He uses the example of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, which was written before Jung came up with this idea about those two parts of ourselves. You know, Dr. Jekyll during the daytime was this respectable, honored doctor who took this powder and at night became Mr. Hyde, right? This ravenous, beast-like individual. And he's talking about the two sides to the self. And so this archetype of the lesser self, the wise self, the spiritual self, the carnal self, those dichotomies, those binaries become examples of the shadow. And that's a story that illustrates this idea of the shadow very well. We can recognize the shadow in our excesses, our addictions, and perversions. I think about this story. I asked a member of a rock and roll band, a famous rock and roll band one time, who I knew to be in recovery for alcoholism. And I knew to be somebody who believed in God, a very, very traditional form of God, of Christianity. And I asked him, because in all of the bands, and the band was really big in the 80s and 90s and still was big recently, I said, you have a lot of satanic symbols in your art, in your image. What was that about? Because I know you don't worship the devil. I know you don't believe in that. And he said, you know, for us as 18, 19-year-old kids, it was just something that would piss our parents off. Something that would make them angry. That's what it was symbolic. And we couldn't think of anything that would terrify them more and upset them more and anger them more than worshiping the devil. That's what it was for us. And that's an example how the anger, right, that was not given a place in their families, expressed itself in this kind of perverted way, this exaggerated way, right? This really dishonest way, if you will. That's an example where Jung talks about where your shadow has you. You know, what's the difference between having a shadow and your shadow has you is when it takes over, when you become a caricature, an exaggeration of what is really authentic, honest anger and sadness and hurt, right? So when you can make peace, if you will, with that devil, you can unmask it and understand its sweetness and its authenticity and its origin, which in the case of these rock stars, these famous rock stars, was the abandonment in their childhood by their parents. We see it in our projections, right? The things that I see in you, both loving you and also despising you, those are elements of my shadow self, right? I virtually can't see something in somebody else that I don't see in myself. But when I have a very strong reaction to those projections, one way or the other, that's more evidence of it being a part of the shadow, part of the split off part, the unexplored part. So having a reaction, a strong hate, an incredible, powerful love, or a scapegoating kind of experience with another person is evidence of our shadow self. The feedback that we get from other people and our reaction to it can be a way to see our shadow. You know, those parts of ourselves that we don't want to look at. Our shame, what humiliates us, what embarrasses us, is part of our shadow. Right? If we had, and this is just a hypothetical, if we could just imagine somebody who's completely integrated and completely whole, they would have no shame. Right? There would be no dark part of themselves, because if they tripped and fell, they wouldn't be embarrassed, because what's there to be embarrassed about? If they made a big mistake, they wouldn't be ashamed or embarrassed of it, because it is just what they are. They would see it and have compassion. So our shame, our humiliation is evidence of or an example of meeting our shadow. Like I talked about, when the shadow takes over, it becomes a compulsion, an addiction, identifications, exaggerated behaviors, impulsiveness. That's why so much of what we try to do in therapy with your children is take a non-reactive, to take a compassionate approach, even to their symptoms, even to their harmful symptoms. And so when we meet them with that kind of grace, for lack of a different word, when we embrace them, instead of shun them, instead of merely behaviorally react to them and try to get them to go away, we can help your child to integrate it, to make sense out of it, to understand where it comes from, and to heal it. Our vehement denials, right? Methinks thou dost protest too much. Those can be evidence. Our defensiveness around aspects of ourselves can be evidence of our shadow. We see it in our media, in our art, and in our heroes. More simply put, these are some examples. And our exaggerated feelings. I can't believe he would do that. Our negative feedback from others who serve as our... There's a couple of typos there. I apologize. This is the third time you arrived late without calling me. Our impulsive and inadvertent acts. Oops, I didn't mean to do that. Our humiliation. I'm so ashamed about how he treats me. Our exaggerated anger about others' faults. Boy, he really let his weight get out of control. So those are examples of where we can find the shadow, the unintegrated, unexplored, split up parts of ourselves, which, by the way, have more impact on our lives in many ways than our conscious self. That's the whole thing of therapy, is to move that line of the conscious lower and lower into the unconscious, and then we have control over it. But most of us have so much shame and humiliation, and we've been wired to hate and be repulsed by our mistakes, our weaknesses, our limitations, our humanness, that we don't heal it. We just push it down, and it crops up somewhere else in our garden. What's the effect of our shadow? Our shadow is the most honest part of ourselves. It's misunderstood, misinterpreted, and sometimes its expression isn't clear, but it's honest. It's pure in many ways. It has a lot of energy, a lot of creative energy, a lot of emotional energy, a lot of passion. That's why depression is Depression isn't sadness. It's more complex. Depression is a depression, right? It is a dent, if you will, a pushing down of parts of ourselves. And so the way out of depression is to open up, to be free, to grieve, to feel, to challenge things. One of the things I think about this, several years ago when I was going through a particularly rough time, and I was sharing with my therapist, I wasn't suicidal, but I found it hard to just go each day. I would tell my therapist, sometimes I don't want to kill myself, but I just don't want to live anymore. It's too hard. And she said something to me that made all the difference in the world, that for me and also for many people that I've shared it with. She said, the thing about it is, Brad, is you don't need to die. Not all of you, but part of you needs to die to become free and to become happy. And the minute she told me that, it changed for me. I realized I had to let go of something. I had to kill something, metaphorically. And the mistake that suicidal people make is that all of them needs to die, and that's not true. Part of them needs to die, and it's easy to make that error, but we can't imagine that. So, and when we do that, we have access to the treasure, to the wisdom, to the energy, to the passion, to the wisdom, to all of that stuff that our unconscious shadow self has to offer. Carl Jung said that neurosis is always a substitute form of legitimate suffering. So that is to say, if we can legitimately feel and be authentic, then we're not going to develop neurotic behaviors to communicate those, to leak those out, to express those. Those things which are hidden in us can become mutated, perverted, and invisibly influential and take over. So there is a little bit of fear, there is a bit of letting go, there is a little bit of faith, if you will, involved in this work. And for a lot of you, that's where we try to help you move from a place with your children, a place of fear, a place of focusing on the symptoms, to understanding what's going on. And then we have to let go of some constructs. We have to let go of some ideas. We have to kill off parts of ourselves and evolve in this process in order to provide a better parenting, a better child context for our child, whether they're a young adult or an adolescent or even a younger child. Carl Jung said we all have a shadow, or does a shadow have us? He explained this in this riddle when he asked the question, how do you find a lion that has swallowed you? Right? And so if it's so unconscious that we don't know what we don't know, it's hard to find it. And so these ideas that Zweig and Abrams present in the book give us ideas into how we can see it in ourselves, first and foremost, but they also offer us some wisdom and some insight into how we can learn to see it in our children. You've all heard the phrase, or many of you have heard the phrase, that children that need the most love have the most unloving way of asking for it. Right? So when we change our vision, when we change our capacity to hear, things will start to sound different. We won't hear disrespect, we'll hear pain. We won't hear an insult, we'll hear hurt and powerlessness. It's not that I ask you, or anybody asks you, not to feel what you feel, but you actually don't feel that anymore. There are things that people say to me now that don't affect me the way they did 10 years ago, 15 years ago, 20 years ago. The same is true with you. And that's part of the reframing that goes on in family therapy, is you begin to hear things differently. So you're not white-knuckling it and avoiding authentic feeling. You're actually not feeling the same. You see a child acting out, and you don't get frustrated. You become compassionate and interested and curious. So that's part of what this exercise and this theory can offer. Carl Jung talked about the idea of becoming whole as the goal for therapy, and he had this famous quote that said, I would rather be whole than good. Good is the enemy of perfection. Good is the enemy of progress, right? That's a lot of what Brené Brown's work is about, this work of vulnerability and imperfection, is this idea that we can show up and be human. In my book, that's what I talk about in the chapter on shame, while using the Old Testament to describe it, that the thing that happened after Adam and Eve transgressed the law, the rule, and ate the forbidden fruit was that the serpent told them to run and hide because they were naked. And the mistake that they made is they believed that lie. They believed that their naked, raw, human self was unacceptable from the divine. So they ran away and hid. So we learn to embrace those split split off parts of ourselves, those parts of ourselves that frighten us, those parts of ourselves that we have imagined to be evil, right? Those things that we have been taught are the devil inside of us. And in the movie, what was that? The Godfather, he said, keep your friends close and your enemies even closer. This is something I often say to the students. I give them that quote and I said, what do you think that means in terms of in psychology? Not related to other people. What does it mean about you? And the answer is, in the movie, he meant that, you know, you keep your friends close, but you've got to keep an eye on your enemies. Because if you don't, they're going to get you. And that's the same with our shadow self. The more we look into it, the more we explore it, the more we understand it, the less it's going to run our lives. And when we understand it and decode it, it looks different to us. And it offers us something. In our program, we have an assignment called the War Story Assignment. The War Story Assignment is one where we ask your children to write usually 2 war stories. Stories of drug usage, of self-harm, of violence, whatever it is that they were into. Right? Gaming, ad nauseum, whatever it is. And we say, write it like it's the best thing that ever happened. Write it like you're trying to brag about it. Like you're telling a war story. And then share that with the group and send it home. And we do that because often our students and our clients come to us and saying, I was wrong, I was bad, I need to stop, my parents are right. Now some of you said I would have welcomed that from my child, but many of them will start to kind of learn what they think to be the rules. And then we say that it's not that simple. Don't go there so fast. Why did you love it? You didn't do it because it made you miserable. You do it because it fed something in you. It was somehow an expression. And by the way, think about the music over the last 50, 60 years. Every generation has a brand of music that is offensive and frightening to the older generation, and evidence to the older generation that the younger generation is more deranged and devolved and satanic and evil and unenlightened as they are. It goes back to Elvis, right? It goes back to the Beatles, to Rolling Stones, to Led Zeppelin, to punk rock, to rap music, right? Over and over. And I always think to myself, when is the first generation going to come where they say, you know what? The music of my children, while confusing to me, it doesn't make sense. I want to see what's underneath it. Why are white, rich, affluent children identifying with rap music? I mean, why is that happening? Instead of just thinking about how evil it is, what's going on there? What are they expressing in that? That's what it looks like when we start to develop integration instead of paying attention to behavioral improvement. So war storying is a way for them to get in touch with and for you to hear about their shadow selves. This poster sat for years in my therapist's office above the head of the couch where I sat. And I would see it when I came in the room. And for years, I never said a thing about it. I would just read it sometimes while I was waiting for her. I would read it. And, you know, if you look closely and it shows up not as obvious in this particular image here, you'll notice that the title of this is Words of Higher Enlightenment. And then you read the words: drop out, fail, quit, lose, relax, give in, flunk, let go, empty, surrender, wait, give over, mellow out, slow down, don't forget, submit, fade away, relinquish, withdraw, flop. I won't read them all, right? These are all words that many of us would associate with wrong or bad or less than or character flaws. The enlightenment, and this is true any way that we talk about the enlightenment is that we can see those parts in ourselves. We understand them, we see them, we have compassion. We don't retreat with shame and humiliation. We don't hate them in us. We understand them. We can see them. So these are words that are about integration. I never, in fact to this day, I've never asked my therapist, I've asked her not to tell me what her meaning was. But I've told her this is what this began to mean for me. In fact, I would give this assignment, we still do, give this assignment to some of your, especially those ones that are trying to be good, especially those ones that are checking all the boxes and trying to move through the program and be good and improve. We ask them to read this and we don't give them any instruction. We just say, write a page about it. Tell us about it. And it's kind of this projective test to see if they understand, if they can make sense out of this idea of enlightenment. Because enlightenment isn't being good. Enlightenment is recognition of our whole self, like Jung talked about. You know, when we start to think about things in the way that Jung did, we understand that the development of our child is more important than them getting it right. We start to pay and honor more attention to the mistakes and how that can teach us and them. I had a client recently that was considering wilderness therapy. We were talking about that, and at one point, not giving them advice, we discussed the idea, the pros and cons of loosening up the structure. And they were second guessing themselves and insecure about it and unsure and tiptoeing around. And they decided, you know, we're going to loosen up a little bit, see how that goes. And of course they loosened up and things got much worse. So much worse that it became absolutely clearly obvious that wilderness therapy was needed. They had no doubt. And we talked about it afterwards, and the discussion was like, it was the perfect thing to do. Not because it worked. Not because it led to the cessation of your son's behavior that eventually is ending him up in wilderness program, but because you got clear. You learned what you need to learn. You have no doubt. It worked perfectly. That's a different way of thinking about it, instead of making decisions as a parent or as a person so that it all goes right. Right? It all goes well. In the simplest way. I think about quieting the crowd, the audience, the voices that we hear that are in our head that we take on, right? I think about when I played Little League Baseball. I was an average player. In practice, I was the best. In the game, I was very average, sometimes horrible, sometimes fairly good, because I was so sensitive and aware of the onlookers and could hear them so loudly that I lost focus. I was unable to be myself and to access my talents and my gifts that I had as a young baseball player. So we learn to quiet the crowd. We learn to make peace with ourselves. We learn to not let those other voices impact us as much. In Jungian therapy, you're much less directive. There's a lot that influences me in Jungian therapy, and that's why I will say, I'm not going to give people advice. And even when I say that to people will say to me after working with me for a while, I know you don't give advice, but, and then they'll ask me a question that's asking for advice. And most all of the time that I'm doing it well, I say, let's talk about it. Let's talk about what you're thinking. And then they come to the conclusion that is theirs, not mine. So we do that with your children, right? That's the whole idea behind the name Evoke, to pull out from them, to create an experience where they find themselves, not where I put myself, my truth onto them, or that I become the agent for the parent, putting all of the parent's values and ideas about truth onto the child. The child finds access to his truth. But that's frightening as a parent, because the possibility exists that their truth might scare us, that their truth might not be our truth. And so we tend to be tempted to seek control. The 7 challenges I've talked about, this is an approach to addiction. It's this idea where you help somebody who's struggling with substance abuse disorder to be honest with themselves. You don't try to sell them on it or convince them or preach to them or debate with them. Right? That's just good therapy. It's not your job to decide whether your child is an addict. It's not your job. It never is. Go to Al-Anon. Go to Codependence Anonymous. Those are the programs, the self-help programs that are the most prolific ones in this country, at least, in helping family members of addicts. It's not your business. What is your business as a parent is what you feel comfortable with. I'm not comfortable with my 16-year-old using marijuana. That I know. But that's not a discussion about making the point, being right about the fact that it's wrong, being right about the fact that marijuana is unhealthy or dangerous. That doesn't matter. You can't win that. I know, I treat your children. That's not a winning battle. But it's an automatic win when I say, I'm not okay with it. This is my boundary. This is my limit. And so the 7 challenges is a philosophy that encourages us out of the power struggle and into that place. So the student work that we do. The student work is about them coming to know themselves. And that's why we have to reduce and dampen the shame. We have to take our foot off the gas and the pedal, so to speak, with regard to behavior change. Right? Just as often, I tell my students and clients, stop trying to change so fast. It's not going to work. That's not the point. Right? Just as often, if not more, do I say that. So that we can slow down and look and learn at what's going on. There's something that this substance abuse is telling you. There's something that this cutting is telling you. There's something that this rage and anger can be telling you. There's truth there. Let's explore it first. They begin to be honest with themselves in a non-shaming atmosphere. They do that through writing their fourth and fifth step, through confession. Viktor Frankl said that his version of therapy was not that you had to go to therapy to hear something difficult, it's that you went to therapy to say something difficult. So they begin through a process that I'm just calling confession. They learn through peer feedback, through letter writing, which is very intentional, very slow, very, very permanent on the page, so that we can look at it. And of course, contemplation. We take away so many of the distractions, the outlets, the noise, the electronics, the peer groups, right? The media, all that. We take that away and provide an opportunity for contemplation and self-reflection. And then they begin to integrate. And with that integration comes a mastery of self. They begin to understand the function of their symptoms. One of my favorite assignments was to give students the assignment of write a purpose of destructive behaviors paper. That's an assignment in our curriculum. I want you to write a paper about all the benefits of your depression. And they would typically look at me like I was insane, and they'd say, there's no benefits. And I'd say, yeah, there's some. People lower the bar. You tend to get compassionate responses from people. You get attention. You're here. We're paying attention to you. In fact, you're on suicide watch, which means there's a lot of attention given to you. Right? So there's benefits. Let's talk about it. Let's talk about the benefits of drug use, the benefits. So if you can begin to look at the function of the symptoms, which is another way of exploring your shadow self, you can make sense out of it, unravel it. Validating the need that the symptom is expressing. What is crack cocaine dependence expressing? People that treat drug abuse, substance abuse disorder will talk about it in that way. They'll say it's not defined by how much you drink or how often you drink or how drunk you get. What it's defined by is the spiritual disorder inside. It's not going to school or not going to school isn't my point. School refusal isn't my point. Depression cutting isn't my point. Anorexia is not my point. My point is what's the disorder inside? What's the feeling? What's this masking? What's this serving? That's the discussion that Jungian therapy and meeting the shadow looks at. Sometimes students will say, what's in it for me? And a lot of people have a strong reaction to that because of their shadow self, where they weren't allowed to take care of themselves, and they'll get angry, and this is just a self-centered young child. And my response is, that's the fairest question for the client to ask. What's in it for me? And my answer is joy, serenity, connection, a sense of love and compassion towards and from other people, right? If I can't offer you an idea about what's in it for you, why would I ever want you to do something that's going to lead to unhappiness in your life in the long run, right? Why? Why would I want you to practice service unless it was going to give you a sense of gratitude and a sense of connection? If offering service to other was going to rob you of happiness and joy and connection, I would tell you never to serve. Sometimes we'll take away the curriculum. We'll take away the assignments because they go through this box checking exercise, trying to get it right. Right? And like I said, sometimes we become much less directive with people whose shadow self is larger and more repressed. The parent work, don't look for the right answers. Slow down. Be quieter. Right? Less is more. Be patient. Decide and come to conclusions slower. The highs aren't that high and the lows aren't that low. Be curious instead of impressed. Be curious instead of disappointed. Right? learn to be honest and assertive and let go of the outcome. Authentic, honest, compassionate, loving, clear, and let go of the outcome. Reinforce honesty over compliance. That includes their expression of anger and hatred, sadness toward you or about you. And de-emphasize compliance as an attribute for them to develop. Be slow to judge. I said that. I love this story because my son was in high school, and some of you who know who Banksy is, he's a graffiti artist and a very famous one, and has an interesting persona where nobody really knows what he looks like and doesn't get his picture taken and does it in the middle of the night and everything. So in English there was this assignment about writing about an artist. My son happens to be an artist and eventually got into art school because of his graffiti art. But this was long before that. And so he wrote a paper, I think it was in 10th grade, 11th grade. He wrote a paper about Banksy and got, I think, a C on the paper. And the teacher wrote on there, "This is not art. This is not an artist." And some weeks later, she went to the Sundance Film Festival where they were having a film, a documentary, based on Banksy. And she watched it. And she was blown away. And she came back with a greater awareness, a new judgment, gave my son an A on the paper. So the parent work, we have got to evolve. We've got to stop doing what every generation does, right? To evolve and to say, we're going to learn to listen. We're going to learn to open our minds. We're going to learn to see with different eyes. We're going to stop having this attitude that the upcoming generation is worse than we are. They're not. That doesn't mean that there aren't horrible things that happen in the world and horrible acts by individuals. But rap music isn't worse than Elvis. It just had to become more and more extreme to make its point. But parents say about rap music the same thing that my grandparents said to my mother about Elvis. Right? They say the exact same thing, that he is of the devil. That's what my grandparents told my mother growing up. Jungian therapy. Psychotherapy offers a ritual for the renewal in which the shadow personality can be brought to awareness and assimilated, thus reducing its inhibiting or destructive potentials and releasing trapped positive life energy. It's a very succinct idea about the goal of therapy, making things more conscious. Here's some quotes from Jung and Jungian therapy. Every form of addiction is bad, no matter whether the narcotic be alcohol, morphine, or idealism. Right? And the point is not that it's bad or good, is that we can learn to start to see the addiction in everything, the extreme in everything. Right? We stop making one side. It's when somebody describes, even in politics, when somebody describes something as all bad or all good, when they paint one side with one color, with one brush, I immediately become distrustful. I immediately am aware of the projections. I remember years ago I was listening to the radio on the way to work, on the way to the field, and I heard somebody describe one of the presidents at the time. And the discussion was something like, did you see anything that this particular president did good? And the guest said no. And then they started to list off a very specific program, however small it was, but it was a program that was substantial and a project of this particular president. And he said, were you aware that the president did this? And the guest said, I had no idea. Because the guest couldn't see wholeness. Because he himself was less whole. Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to a better understanding of ourselves. Nothing has a stronger influence psychologically on their environment, and especially on their children, than the unlived life of a parent. So our lack of wholeness, our lack of integration is going to be passed on in some ways to our children. We cannot change anything unless we accept that condemnation does not liberate, it oppresses. Again, that's a different stance, a different attitude toward our children, their disorders, their symptoms, their addictions, their depression, everything. A man who has not passed through the inferno of his own passions has never overcame them. Knowing your own darkness is the best method for dealing with the darkness of others. That particular bullet point is just an invitation. I'll say this a little bit later. Almost every question you could ask me about childbearing, what can I do? I had a parent recently at some parent event that I was at ask about bullying. How do I, gave some examples of bullying and what do we do? And I started to answer the question specifically about how you listen to the child and how you give them a safe place to talk about it and empower them. And then I said, I realized as I went, 60 seconds into answering this question, I just said, go to therapy. You go to therapy. And that might seem very indirect, but that's how you get it. That's how you do better. You want to help your children, go to therapy. You want to help your children, go to Coda and Al-Anon. Everything I know tells me the most impactful way for you to know how to deal with the darkness in your children is to become aware of and look at the darkness that you have inside of yourself. Man needs difficulties. They are necessary for health. This was Jung's idea, who, I told this many times, the example, somebody would come and say, I got a promotion at work, and he would say, well, if we all stick together and gather around each other and support each other, we'll get through this together. But when somebody came in and said, I'm going through a divorce, or I just found out about a serious health concern, he'd say, let's pop a bottle of champagne. It's time to celebrate. Because he was trying to tell them that on the other side of that thing that is frightening is something beautiful and wonderful. And on the other side of that thing that is beautiful and wonderful is also something frightening. He wanted to see the whole and introduce the idea of wholeness to his clients. There's no coming to consciousness without pain. Your vision will become clear only when you look into your own heart. Who looks outside dreams, who looks inside awakes. Love this quote by Jung. Show me a sane man and I will cure him for you. Again, and in this metaphor, sanity is put together, sealed up tight, right? Repressed, perfect, good, right? Those are things that on one level we look at and we might admire, but Jung would say oftentimes can be evidence of a lack of integration. That's why enlightened souls can admit and look at and see their own inadequacies, their own limitations, their own struggles. Some readings for you to look at. This is from the book Meeting the Shadow by Zweig and Abrams. Memories, Dreams, and Reflections by Jung. The Undiscovered Self by Jung. And Man and His Symbols. Those are some of the books that were referenced tonight. Take home for you. Value the journey over the destination. Never arrive. That is the most frightening place. When parents come to my parent meeting and they say, I realize I'm struggling, I realize I need help, I realize how much I don't listen, I'm thinking, oh, this is going great. When parents come to my meeting and say, I think I'm a good parent, we've been a good parent, I'm terrified. Right? And I worry about that for the child. Value struggles and mistakes. Like I talked about earlier, if we value them, if we make meaning out of them, if they inform us, if they cause us to be more aware of something, ours and others, then we engender wholeness and integration. Embrace and learn and lean into difficulties, those of our children and ourselves. It's similar to the idea of radical acceptance. If we just use the language and the idea that we're off track and we need to get back on track, we will lose access to the wisdom, the learning that the struggle has to offer us. It's not easy. It's not that you're going to skip around and be happy or not be sad, but you're going to lean into it. Value wholeness and honesty over compliance and obedience. All right? Even when it's how they're talking to you. That's why when a child says to you, I hate you, you might consider saying, I'm glad you're talking to me about it. I'm not so pleased with myself sometimes. When somebody can come to us and tell us how they feel, if we can, you don't have to. It's not repressing your feelings, but if we can have the ears to hear it and say, I'm glad you're talking, I'd rather you talk to me about it than not talk to me about it. I don't know what you would do with that anger or that hurt if you couldn't talk about it. And I'm glad I can be the one that you're willing to talk to. I'm honored that you would tell me. Doing your own work is almost always the answer when we are upset and wondering about how to help our children. Just what I said earlier. In the end, as a therapist, as a parent, I can't think of something more. All the things I've read, all my studying, my practice, all my college degrees, all that stuff, while necessary for a foundation, the thing that makes the biggest difference in my capacity to be with a client and to help them is my work. The therapy that I've been in for the better part of 30 years. From the time I was 8 years old, really. And the last 17 years consistently with the same therapist. That's the thing that gives me the ability to do what I do. That's how I can sit with a client and see them, because I've seen my darkness. If my son is honest about violating a boundary and we enforce the consequence, then how do you value honesty over compliance? He's upfront about saying he won't be honest if he's going to suffer the consequences. Yeah, this is not a compromise of consequences. This is, and he, in his life, can learn that, if he steals, he might go to jail. Right? But what it doesn't get layered with is shame and anger and rage and disappointment and frustration. That's the stuff that doesn't rub off. Right? And he can say, well, how can I be honest with you if I know there's going to be a consequence? You're going to take away my car if I'm drinking and driving, right? You're going to ground me if I steal, whatever it is, right? That's his choice. It's not the consequence. See, children can adjust to, I talk about in the chapter, Control versus Influence in my book, children can adjust to varying levels of structure. What they have a difficult time and almost can never adjust to is the emotional coercion, the judgment, the shame, the anger, the rage. Those are the things that lead to repression and the greater shadow. But consequences are what they are. There's no shame about it. It's just a logical consequence and a boundary that you set in your life. And if he says that he won't be honest, if he's going to suffer the consequences, that's his choice. You can say, I'm sorry. I can imagine that to be true. I've lied in my life. You can tell him that. Say, I've lied in my life to avoid consequences. And if you're honest, you have. Right? You're aware of that. I'm a recovering sex and love addict and have learned many of the ideas you've shared. And I have shared what I have learned with my daughter, who is at Evoke. While I think she understands the ideas, she cannot live these ideas. How does a young mind begin to live these ideas? It takes a lot of time. Thank you for the courage in writing this. The reason why I think it's profound that you share that you're a sex and love addict and you've learned many of these ideas, because in our culture, sexuality, sex and love addiction is seen, it's a larger part of our collective and individual shadows, right? So for you to share that is powerful. Be patient with her. Know that it takes time. Just think about what you had to go through to be ready to understand these principles. Think about that. I suspect that your recovery of sex and love addiction didn't come smoothly. Didn't come in a whisper. I imagine that there were times of despair and turmoil in your life that readied you for what's going on. So keep your boundaries. Be patient with her. Be patient and more patient and more patient. Right? As a therapist, I have people come to me and tell me the most fantastic ideas in the world. And I try to meet them where they're at to understand them and to be patient. I don't need them to be where I'm at. I don't need them to have my agenda met. I don't need that. So be patient. Set your boundaries. Take care of yourself. Watch your codependency. Because your codependency will tell you that she needs to understand, believe, and move along at a quicker pace. That's what your codependency will tell you. But it's okay to set a boundary. It's okay for her not to get it. It's okay for her not to like it. It's okay for her to be confused, to move slowly, to be defensive about it. It's okay for her to do all those things. Just keep your boundaries, plug away, do your work on your codependency, and continue in your recovery. Our son just left Evoke and went to aftercare. He is speaking to us after only 2 weeks about his plans to get a GED in the present program and hopefully be allowed to come home. He speaks with so much insight and honesty, much like you described in this webinar. It is difficult not to wonder if letting him try to remain sober at home could be a choice. We thus far have been absolutely against him coming home before a year of sobriety. He's only 18, not sure what to do. I made this joke recently, and it really is half joke and half truth. Somebody was asking about a child coming home, and I could see the situation was fairly toxic. And I said, I don't think children should ever be with their parents. And everybody laughed, and we had a good laugh about it. But being home is not necessarily the best thing. It might be, my 8-year-old wants to eat cookies for breakfast. I get it. And you know what? Having him home, I'm sure, would be very, for you at least on the outside, the image of it, the idea of it, it would be very rewarding. Work with a professional, take a step back. If he's trying to sell you on something, take a step back. If he can talk about his struggles, his fear about relapsing, his fear about coming home, how he imagines that it will be difficult to be with you, how he still sees the difficulty and the challenges in his relationship. If you can talk about all that, if it's a whole picture instead of a good picture, trust it a little bit more. Do what you're going to do, but make sure. My answer would be get some help with this. Get some coaching. Get somebody who can talk you through it, who can help you to ask yourself questions about yourself, about your relationship with your child, about what you're hearing. Do that work, and then you will be more clear, and then you'll make the decision. And then here's the thing, just like the other thing. If he comes home and it blows up, fantastic. Wonderful. You've got exactly what you needed. And he's learned something and you've learned something. It's not a disaster. It's not a failure. It's not a setback. It is progress. Something you'll build upon. Something that teaches all of you something if you allow it to. All right, folks, upcoming intensives and workshops. We added another Finding You to August. Heroic Journeys for Families. So we're doing this during the summertime. We'll take 2 or 3 families out there and do some work with them in the summertime when they're out of school. So there's that. That's for very intense work. We still have a couple of spots left for our Finding You in June. Sign up soon. The workshop's coming up at Entrada and Cascades. Our first one at Cascades is coming up in June. So there's the address. You can email Gail at evoketherapy.com for more information. Email intensive at evoketherapy.com for intensives. The workshops are multifamily, experiential, psychoeducation. The intensives on the right side of the screen are smaller groups, very intensive, deep work for each of the individuals and families. Our upcoming parent support groups, Southern California, Chicago, and New York City. There are the dates there. It's May 31st. No, I didn't get my slides proofread, as you might have noticed tonight. May 31st, so that's next week. Chicago coming later in the summer. And in June, we have one scheduled for June 12th. Email Stephanie at evoketherapy.com for more information. Go to our website for our high adventure trips for families or young adults. We want all families to go to 6 meetings of these while their children are with us. If you haven't gone yet, even if your child has graduated, please go to 6. Follow us on social media for announcements, inspirational quotes, stories, pictures, and so forth. The book is available on Amazon. And for audio purchase, go to the Parent Alumni Foundation book page for more information. To buy books from Amazon and have a part of your proceeds go to charity to help people pay for therapy who can't afford it. All right, on Monday the 31st at 7 p.m. Mountain Time, I'm going to be talking about the stages of change. I look forward to that. That'll be Memorial Day. So at the end of Memorial Day, after you've had your wonderful long weekend, you can settle down with me at 7 p.m. Mountain Time and listen to how human beings go through change, both in general, psychologically, and specifically at Evoke Therapy programs. All right, folks, hope this point of contact was helpful. Have a great weekend, great holiday weekend, and I'll talk to you Monday night. Take care. Bye-bye.